The architect of economic resurrection. When Adolf Hitler assumed power on January 30th, 1933, he inherited a nation drowning in the wreckage of economic catastrophe. Germany wasn't just broke, it was financially eviscerated. The Treaty of Versailles had transformed the once mighty German Empire into a debtor state, crushed beneath 132 billion gold marks in reparations. Hyperinflation had already ravaged the Weimar Republic in 1923, turning currency into kindling and life savings into worthless paper. By 1933, 6 million Germans were unemployed. Industrial production had collapsed to half its pre-depression levels. The nation's gold reserves were depleted. International credit was non-existent. Banks were failing. Hunger stalked the streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. This was the landscape Hitler surveyed when he took control. A country on its knees, humiliated, impoverished, and seething with resentment. Yet within 6 years, this same broken nation would field the most mechanized, technologically advanced military force the world had ever seen. The Wehrmacht would roll across Europe with thousands of tanks, supported by a modern Luftwaffe that dominated the skies. Germany would sustain a total war effort that required astronomical resources: steel, rubber, oil, munitions, vehicles, aircraft, and the infrastructure to support them. The question that haunts economic historians isn't simply how Germany rearmed, it's how a bankrupted nation financed the most expensive war machine in human history, without gold, without foreign investment, and without the traditional mechanisms of capitalist economics. The answer lies in one of history's most audacious and darkest economic experiments. Hitler's regime didn't rebuild Germany's economy through conventional means. They couldn't. International banks wouldn't lend to them. The global community had isolated them financially. Instead, the Nazi economic apparatus, orchestrated primarily by Hjalmar Schacht and later expanded under Hermann Göring's 4-year plan, constructed an entirely shadow financial system built on manipulation, creative accounting, theft, and what can only be described as economic sorcery. At the core of this system was a simple but revolutionary concept: the complete divorce of money from tangible value. While the world operated on gold standards and international currency agreements, Nazi Germany created money from nothing, phantom capital that existed only on paper, backed by future promises rather than present assets. This began with the Mifo bills, a scheme so brilliant in its deception that it fooled international observers for years. Metallurgical Forschungsgesellschaft, or MIFO, was a dummy corporation established in 1934, nominally a research company for the metallurgical industry. In reality, it existed for one purpose: to hide military spending from both the German public and foreign governments bound by Versailles Treaty restrictions. Here's how the mechanism worked. The German government would order weapons, vehicles, or military equipment from private armaments manufacturers like Krupp, Siemens, or IG Farben. Instead of paying with Reichsmarks that would show up in government budgets and raise international alarm, they paid with Mifo bills, essentially IOUs guaranteed by the Reich but processed through this phantom corporation. Manufacturers could then exchange these bills for cash at the Reichsbank, or use them as collateral for loans, or trade them to other companies. The bills circulated through the economy like real money, lubricating industrial production and employment, but they never appeared in official government accounts. They were financial ghosts. Between 1934 and 1938, the Nazi regime issued 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of Mifo bills, equivalent to roughly $480 billion in today's currency. This hidden debt financed tanks, aircraft, submarines, artillery, and the entire infrastructure of rearmament. Schacht, the economic mastermind behind this scheme, understood that he was building a house of cards. Mifo bills were supposed to mature and be paid off within 5 years, but there was never any actual plan to redeem them with real assets. The system functioned on a single assumption: that Germany would go to war before the bills came due, and that conquest would provide the wealth to pay the debt. This was economic warfare disguised as monetary policy, a Ponzi scheme with tanks instead of dividends. The Nazi leadership understood from the very beginning that their economic model was fundamentally unsustainable. It could only end in 2 ways: complete collapse or total war. They chose war not despite the economic impossibility, but because of it. The regime's spending wasn't reckless, it was calculated. Every Reichsmark conjured from nothing, every Mifo bill printed, every factory converted to military production was a countdown timer ticking towards September 1939. But the Mifo scheme was only the beginning. As rearmament accelerated, the regime needed more steel, more labor, more resources than Germany's depleted economy could provide. They needed foreign currency to purchase materials from abroad, particularly oil and rubber, which Germany lacked. Traditional trade was impossible. Germany had no gold reserves, and international creditors refused them. So they innovated again, creating bilateral trade agreements that bypassed conventional currency altogether.
Germany would trade manufactured goods directly for raw materials with countries in Eastern Europe and South America, never exchanging actual money. These barter arrangements allowed them to acquire critical resources while maintaining the illusion of economic normalcy.
The machinery of plunder. The shadow economy that Hjalmar Schacht engineered was brilliant, but it had limitations. By 1936, the MEFO system was approaching critical mass. The bills were accumulating faster than even phantom assets could absorb them. The regime needed a new source of capital, and they found it through a method as old as conquest itself: systematic theft. But this wasn't crude looting. It was industrialized expropriation, executed with bureaucratic precision and legal camouflage. The first victims were Germany's own citizens. The regime began by targeting those it had already marginalized, the Jewish population. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 had already stripped Jews of citizenship and civil rights, creating a legal framework for what would become the largest internal asset seizure in modern history. Through a process called Aryanization, Jewish-owned businesses, properties, bank accounts, and assets were systematically confiscated and transferred to non-Jewish Germans or absorbed directly into state coffers. This wasn't spontaneous violence. It was coordinated economic warfare against a defenseless population. The numbers reveal the scale. By 1938, approximately 100,000 Jewish businesses had been seized or liquidated. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, the so-called Night of Broken Glass, the regime imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community for the damage the Nazis themselves had orchestrated. Insurance payments for destroyed property were confiscated by the state. Jewish families were forced to sell their assets at a fraction of market value, often under direct coercion. Bank accounts were frozen, then emptied. Real estate was transferred through forced sales. Art collections, jewelry, stocks, bonds, everything of value was cataloged and extracted with bureaucratic efficiency. This wasn't merely cruelty for its own sake, though the regime's anti-Semitism was genuine and pathological. It was also calculated economic policy. The wealth stolen from German Jews provided billions in liquid capital precisely when the rearmament program was straining the economy to breaking point. Every confiscated factory could be converted to military production. Every seized bank account could fund another weapons contract. Every apartment block transferred to the state could house military personnel or be sold to finance infrastructure. The persecution of Jews was simultaneously ideological warfare and economic strategy, a feature, not a bug, of Nazi financial planning. But domestic theft, however extensive, still wasn't enough. The war machine Hitler envisioned required resources Germany simply didn't possess: oil fields, iron ore deposits, chromium, manganese, copper, and above all, the industrial capacity to process these materials into weapons at unprecedented scale. The solution was expansion, not just military conquest, but economic absorption. Before the first shot of World War II was fired, Nazi Germany had already begun its campaign of territorial acquisition and resource extraction. The annexation of Austria in March 1938, the Anschluss, was presented as ethnic reunification, but it was fundamentally an economic operation. Austria possessed gold reserves of approximately 1.4 billion shillings, which the Reichsbank immediately seized. Austrian industrial capacity, particularly in steel production and manufacturing, was integrated into the German war economy. Austrian Jews, who numbered nearly 200,000, were subjected to an even more rapid and brutal Aryanization process than their German counterparts. Within months, their wealth had been systematically stripped and absorbed. The annexation of Austria injected desperately needed capital and productive capacity into Germany's overheating economy. 6 months later came Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement of September 1938 handed Hitler the Sudetenland without a shot fired, but the real prize came in March 1939 when Germany occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This wasn't just about German-speaking populations or Lebensraum. It was about the Škoda Works, one of Europe's largest armaments manufacturers. Overnight, Germany acquired factories capable of producing hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and millions of rounds of ammunition. Czechoslovakian gold reserves stored in the Bank of England were transferred to Germany through complicated financial manipulations. Czechoslovakian industrial output was immediately redirected toward German military production. The occupation of Czechoslovakia alone provided resources equivalent to several years of German manufacturing output. Each conquest followed the same pattern: military occupation, immediate seizure of central bank reserves, confiscation of industrial assets, exploitation of local populations for labor, and systematic extraction of anything valuable. This was economic vampirism on a national scale. The Nazi war machine literally fed on the wealth of conquered territories.
and it had to keep feeding. The system Schacht had created was fundamentally unstable, a bicycle that would fall over the moment it stopped moving. Expansion wasn't optional, it was economically mandatory. By 1939, Germany's entire economic model was built on a simple but terrifying equation: conquer or collapse. The Mefo bills were coming due. The hidden debt was approaching 40 billion Reichsmarks, larger than Germany's entire GDP. There was no gold to back it, no foreign credit to refinance it, no conventional way to service it. The only asset Germany possessed in sufficient quantity was military force, and the only way to monetize that force was through conquest. Hermann Göring, who had assumed control of the four-year plan in 1936, understood this perfectly. His mandate wasn't just rearmament, it was preparing the German economy for total war and designing systems to extract maximum wealth from occupied territories. The four-year plan operated on the assumption of perpetual expansion. It focused on achieving autarky, economic self-sufficiency, through synthetic production and resource substitution. Massive investments went into developing synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel from coal, technologies that would allow Germany to wage war even when cut off from international trade. But these programs were expensive, and they too required capital that didn't exist. The solution, again, was conquest. Poland would provide agricultural resources, France would provide industrial capacity, the Soviet Union would provide oil, grain, and living space. Each invasion was simultaneously a military campaign and an economic extraction operation.
The economics of conquest. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, it wasn't just launching a war, it was executing a financial strategy. The Polish campaign cost approximately 1.3 billion Reichsmarks, but it was never intended to be an expense. It was an investment with immediate returns. Within weeks of occupation, German authorities had seized Poland's gold reserves, dismantled its banking system, and begun the systematic extraction of agricultural output, industrial equipment, and human labor. The occupation apparatus functioned as an economic engine designed to extract more wealth than the conquest consumed. This model, conquest as capital generation, became the core principle of Nazi economic policy during the war. Every occupied territory was immediately subjected to a ruthlessly efficient system of exploitation. Local currencies were pegged to the Reichsmark at artificially favorable rates, allowing Germany to purchase goods with worthless paper. Occupation costs were imposed on conquered populations, forcing them to fund their own subjugation. In France alone, occupation costs reached 400 million Reichsmarks per day, roughly 20 million Reichsmarks annually, extracted directly from the French economy. These weren't reparations paid after defeat, they were ongoing tribute extracted at gunpoint. The scale of this theft is almost incomprehensible. Göring established economic staffs that followed the Wehrmacht into every conquered territory with explicit instructions: seize everything valuable. Raw materials, factory equipment, railroad stock, food supplies, art, currency reserves, everything was cataloged and shipped back to Germany. In the occupied Soviet territories, this extraction reached genocidal proportions. The Hunger Plan, developed before Operation Barbarossa even began, explicitly calculated that 30 million Soviet civilians would starve to death as German forces diverted grain production to feed the Reich and the Wehrmacht. This wasn't collateral damage, it was deliberate policy designed to solve Germany's food shortage through mass murder. The concentration camp system, while fundamentally driven by ideology and racial hatred, was also integrated into this economic apparatus. By 1942, camps operated as vast forced labor reservoirs feeding German industry. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, Siemens, and BMW established facilities adjacent to camps, literally working prisoners to death in pursuit of profit. The SS itself became an economic enterprise through the VWHA, the Economic and Administrative Main Office, which managed labor allocation, operated businesses, and extracted maximum value from human beings before disposing of them. Prisoners were assigned monetary values, their labor was rented to corporations, their possessions were seized, even their bodies were commodified, with gold teeth extracted and hair harvested for industrial use. This is where Nazi economic policy revealed its ultimate depravity. It had transformed human beings into currency. The regime's financial sustainability depended not just on conquering territory, but on extracting value from populations through forced labor, starvation, and eventually industrialized murder. The death camps were many things: instruments of genocide, manifestations of totalitarian evil, expressions of anti-Semitic pathology, but they also functioned as nodes in an economic system that required constant inputs of plundered wealth to survive. Yet even this vast machinery of theft couldn't keep pace with expenditures. By 1941, Germany was spending approximately 60% of its GDP on military operations, a rate no economy can sustain indefinitely. The invasion of the Soviet Union was supposed to solve this problem permanently.
Operation Barbarossa wasn't just military expansion, it was an attempt to seize the resources, oil, grain, minerals, industrial capacity that would finally make the Nazi economy self-sustaining. Hitler and his economic planners genuinely believed that conquering the Soviet Union would provide sufficient plunder to pay off all accumulated debts, fund the occupation of Europe, and establish a permanent war economy capable of dominating the continent. The failure of Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht's inability to capture Moscow, destroy the Red Army, or seize the Caucasus oil fields before winter, was therefore both a military and an economic catastrophe. Without Soviet resources, Germany's economic model couldn't function. The regime responded by intensifying exploitation of already occupied territories, extracting even more brutally from populations that had little left to give. Rations in occupied countries were reduced below starvation levels. Forced labor programs expanded. The Holocaust accelerated, partly because the regime could no longer afford to maintain populations it considered economically useless. By 1943, the economic contradictions had become terminal. Germany was producing enormous quantities of weapons. Tank production actually peaked in 1944, but the resources to fuel, supply, and sustain these forces were evaporating. Synthetic fuel production, despite massive investments, never provided sufficient gasoline. Food shortages affected even German civilians. Critical materials like tungsten, chromium, and copper grew scarce. The occupied territories, already stripped of portable wealth, provided diminishing returns. The Reichsmark, which had maintained fictional stability through price controls and rationing, was effectively worthless outside German-controlled territory. Albert Speer, who became armaments minister in 1942, performed near miracles in rationalizing production and increasing output, but he was optimizing a fundamentally bankrupt system. His efficiency improvements, streamlining manufacturing, concentrating production, ruthlessly exploiting slave labor, extracted maximum output from diminishing inputs, but they couldn't create resources that didn't exist. Germany was burning through its accumulated plunder faster than conquest could replenish it. The economic model required continuous expansion to survive, but by 1943, Germany was contracting. Every lost territory meant lost resources. Every defensive battle consumed irreplaceable stocks. The strategic bombing campaign by the Allies specifically targeted this economic vulnerability. Attacks on synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, and transportation networks weren't just disrupting production. They were severing the arteries of an economy that had no reserves, no slack, no redundancy. When a synthetic fuel plant was destroyed, there was no alternative source. When rail lines were cut, supplies couldn't reach factories. The Nazi economy had been built on continuous flow and maximum exploitation with no safety margins. It was exquisitely fragile, and the Allies systematically shattered it.
The collapse of phantom wealth. By 1944, the economic fiction that had sustained the Third Reich for over a decade was disintegrating. The Mefo bills, those phantom financial instruments that had launched rearmament, had long since matured unpaid. The bilateral trade agreements that had circumvented international currency markets were meaningless when Germany controlled no trade routes. The plundered wealth of occupied Europe, the gold reserves, the seized factories, the stolen art, sat in warehouses and vaults, even as German cities burned under Allied bombardment. All the conjured money, all the creative accounting, all the theft and extraction had produced exactly what economics predicted, a catastrophic reckoning. The regime's response to economic collapse revealed the fundamental relationship between Nazi ideology and financial policy. Rather than rational resource allocation or strategic retreat, the leadership intensified its most destructive impulses. As defeat became inevitable, the Holocaust accelerated. Resources that could have supplied combat units were instead directed towards transporting Jews to death camps. Railway capacity desperately needed for military logistics was used to ship Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in spring 1944, even as Soviet forces advanced toward the Reich's borders. This wasn't irrational. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had always valued ideological objectives above economic sustainability. The final months saw the complete breakdown of monetary coherence. The Reichsmark, maintained through artificial controls and threat of violence, lost all purchasing power. Soldiers and civilians reverted to barter. Black markets dominated exchange. Cigarettes became more valuable than currency. The regime printed money frantically, but paper without productive capacity behind it is just paper. The industrial base that had sustained military production was systematically destroyed, bombed by allies, sabotaged by forced laborers, and in some cases deliberately demolished by German forces implementing Hitler's Nero Decree, which ordered the destruction of German infrastructure to prevent its capture. What remained was debt, staggering, unpayable, almost abstract in its enormity. The German government's outstanding obligations by 1945 totaled over 400 billion Reichsmarks, roughly 4 times the country's 1939 GDP. The Mefo bills alone represented debt that would have taken decades to service under normal economic conditions. The occupation costs extracted from conquered territories, the loans forced upon satellite states, the securities issued to finance endless production,
All of it was revealed as worthless paper, backed by nothing except the military force that had now been defeated. The post-war analysis of Nazi economics revealed something profoundly disturbing. The entire system had been a sophisticated form of economic suicide. Hjalmar Schacht, interrogated after the war, admitted that he'd always known the MEFO scheme was unsustainable. He designed it as a short-term mechanism to jumpstart rearmament, assuming civilian leadership would eventually impose fiscal discipline. Instead, the regime had accelerated spending beyond even Schacht's projections, and when he'd protested in 1937, he'd been marginalized. By 1939, he'd resigned from the Reichsbank, having lost all control over the monster he'd helped create. The question that haunts historians isn't whether Nazi economic policy was sustainable. It obviously wasn't, but whether sustainability was ever the objective. Evidence suggests the regime's leadership understood from the beginning that their model required perpetual expansion or total collapse. They chose expansion, not despite the economic impossibility, but because economic impossibility provided justification for the wars of conquest they ideologically desired. The financial architecture didn't fail due to miscalculation. It was designed to necessitate exactly the war of annihilation that Hitler had always intended. This transforms our understanding of Nazi aggression. The invasions, the occupations, the systematic plunder weren't consequences of a war that happened to break out. They were the intended function of an economic system purpose-built for conquest. Germany didn't go to war because it was strong. It went to war because it was broke, and the regime had deliberately engineered that bankruptcy to make war economically mandatory. Every MEFO bill issued, every Jewish business seized, every forced trade agreement signed was a mechanism pushing Germany towards September 1939 and beyond. The human cost of this economic experiment defies comprehension. The Holocaust, the war itself, the destruction of European Jewry, the millions of Soviet civilians starved and murdered, the slave laborers worked to death, all of it flowed from an economic model that treated human beings as resources to be extracted and discarded. The regime's financial innovations weren't separate from its genocidal policies. They were integrated components of the same system. The death camps and the MEFO bills served the same master, a totalitarian state that had replaced economic rationality with ideological fanaticism and backed its phantom currency with blood. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, it possessed essentially nothing of value. The gold reserves were depleted or scattered, the industrial capacity was destroyed, the currency was worthless, the accumulated debt was beyond calculation. The regime had consumed everything, its own people, its neighbors, its future, in pursuit of an impossible vision financed with imaginary money. The economic miracle that foreign observers had marveled at in the mid-1930s, the seemingly impossible transformation from bankruptcy to military superpower, was revealed as the greatest fraud in modern history. The lesson isn't subtle. Economics built on theft, sustained by violence, and backed by nothing but willingness to conquer, will inevitably collapse. The Nazi regime didn't discover some secret formula for generating wealth from nothing. They simply delayed the inevitable reckoning through increasingly desperate and brutal extraction. Every mark conjured from thin air, every asset stolen, every population exploited was borrowed against a future that could never repay the debt. The bill eventually came due, and the cost was measured in tens of millions of lives. The question wasn't where the war money came from. The answer was always clear. It came from nowhere. It was phantom capital, sustained by theft and violence, backed by nothing but the willingness to murder. Germany wasn't funding a war machine. It was operating a Ponzi scheme with tanks, and when the scheme collapsed, it took the entire continent down with it. That was the true economic miracle of the Third Reich, the transformation of nothing into catastrophe, the monetization of evil itself, and the proof that an economy built on lies will always end in ruins.